Chapter, Exodus chapter 2, verse 1. We're working on a series now of traveling through the wilderness, or as some like to call it, God who wants to be known, and that's our goal as well as we learn from the Scriptures together. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and dabbed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." And then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked over on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" And he answered, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" And then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. And when they came home to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. And she gave birth to a son, and he called him Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." During these many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And this is the word of the Lord. Last week, if you remember, we began this series with a statement that salvation from the hand of God is more than just delivering us from things that are oppressing us. Salvation from the hand of God is to deliver us from those things that we have made our main things, the things that we really worship, the things that we really are most concerned about in life. And those main things, if they're not God, will become that which enslaves us. Enslaves us, first of all, because serving anything other than God as your main thing will cause you to be indebted to that thing. It will demand more and more and more of you until you are finally consumed by it. But more than that, there is always this fear that you are going to lose that thing. And so in fear and in enslavement go together, and turning us into the anxious people that we often are, worried about things that are not ours to begin with. And now God promises us that He will deliver us from those enslavements. That's the nature of God's delivery. The people of Israel will certainly need that kind of deliverance, as they have been in bondage now in Egypt for over 400 years. We don't know exactly how the tables turned for Egypt and Israel, whether it was several hundred years before they made them slaves, or whether that happened rather quickly. But somewhere along the line in that continuum of time, Israel became a slave into Egypt. Chapter 2 tells us at the end that they groaned because of their affliction and cried out for help. It's interesting that it doesn't say that they groaned and cried out to the Lord for help. They just cried out. We don't know either what happened during those 400 years, whether Israel could remember their relationship with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and their father Jacob, or whether that was a forgotten thing. 7, 10 generations passed. It only takes one generation, as Billy Graham said, to lose our faith completely. And so it was in those days, perhaps they were just groaning and crying out. But the interesting thing is that God heard their groans. He heard their cries, and He remembered the promise that He made to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So we have to think about that this morning. What was it like for God's people to wait on the Lord for His answer? We know, of course, much more than they did about the relationship that we can have with God and the God who wants relationship with us. But God was working already back then. He wants to be known by His people. So in this account, I think we can learn 3 lessons, 3 principles that we can apply to our own lives individually and collectively as the Church of Jesus here at Prosper. The first one is this, that we can be assured that God is always, always on the side of the oppressed and the abused. It's so important for us to realize. God is on the side of the oppressed, not the oppressor. Now, we could quote verse after verse about that, the warnings that God gave to His people over and over again. Proverbs 11, for example, be assured, an evil person will not go unpunished, but the offspring of the righteous will be delivered. Or Proverbs 22, whoever sows injustice will reap calamity, and the rod of his fury will fall. And these words from Isaiah 10, God says, woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and writers who keep writing oppression, to turn aside the needy from justice, and to rob the poor of my people of their right, that widows may be their spoil, that they may make fatherless their prey. What will you do on the day of judgment, in the ruin that will come from afar? To whom will you flee for help, and where will you leave your wealth? Nothing remains but to crouch among the prisoners or fall among the slain. For all of this, His anger has not been turned away, and His hand is stretched out still. Vengeance is mine, God says, I will repay. Now, this is so very important for us as Christians to understand, that though we are wronged, and even though there are no authorities or officials who are going to claim and reclaim us into our rightfulness, we are in the same kind of situation as the Egyptians at times. We cry out for fairness. Our first reaction is to avenge and to plot revenge against those people and to settle the score. We want justice. We want them to pay. And yet, we are taught very clearly that vengeance belongs to the Lord. He might use the law enforcement to clear up the injustices, and that would be good. But there are times when God says, vengeance is mine. I will repay. Miroslav Volf, a Croatian pastor and a professor at Yale Divinity School today, knows well what the Croatians suffered as they went through their terrible times of oppression and the crimes against the people of God especially. Volf writes this. He says, "The practice of nonviolence requires a belief in the divine vengeance." Simply that. The practice of nonviolence requires a belief in God's divine vengeance. It is mine to repay. So we know Egypt will not get by with anything. God will make sure of that. But it's not up to Moses or it's not up to the people of Israel to bring on that vengeance. This is God's work to be done. And it's a comfort for us, you see, because when we take things into our own hands, we tend to deal with more problems afterwards. So all they were left with was the response, was to wait. That brings us to the second most important principle. The truth is this, that we cry out for God's timing, but it's often not our timing. And so that puts us into what I like to call God's waiting room. All of us have sat in waiting rooms in various places, doctors' offices, hospitals. We know what it's like to wait and wait and wait some more. For Israel, this time of oppression was a time of serious waiting. Where were things going to turn so that they could have hope once again? But being in God's waiting room is never, ever easy. When we cry out for deliverance from our oppressors, we would like immediate action from God. Now, I know that God could have chosen 100, even 1,000 different means by which He could have delivered Israel from Egypt. God could have had another force, an army bigger than the Egyptian army, and overrun the whole country of Egypt and set the people free that way. Or God could have done it as He did years later back up in Babylon when the king of Babylon had captured the Israelite people, the Judea people, brought them into captivity, and the people were despairing, saying, how will we ever go home again? And then, amazingly, a new king, a Persian king, comes onto the throne, and he says to the people of Judah, if you want to go home, go home. And they were set free just like that, after 70 years of oppression. So God can choose whatever means He wants in order to deliver His people out of their bondage. But when the people of Israel now are languishing, they're suffering down in Egypt, they groan and cry out for help. But God, it appears, chooses not to work immediately. Time and time again, nothing seems to be happening. Where is God? About 1/3 of the Psalms that are in the Bible are songs of lament. This is the plea of God's people saying, how long, O Lord, how long must we wait for your deliverance to come? And people throughout history have asked that same question over and over again. How long? But when the people of Israel languished and their cries went up, it seems as there's only delay. But God has His reasons, and those reasons are given to us later on in Exodus chapter 6. Firstly, it says that He's doing it so the Israelites will know His name. Yahweh, the one true I am God, the sovereign God of the universe. He allows things to go terribly wrong so that He might display the power of His outstretched hand and His mighty arm. Secondly, God waits in this case so that beyond the shadow of a doubt, these people will know that it is God who has done the deliverance. This is not going to be from Moses, it's not going to be from Aaron, it's not going to be from any other person, but this is God who splits the waters and causes the people to walk through it. The salvation belongs to the Lord. And thirdly, he's working the scenes, behind the scenes, simply to show his people how much uniquely loved they are. God is into something bigger than simply delivering them from the bondage of Egypt. He's delivering them from bondage to sin itself. He wants his people to know that they can have an intimate relationship with this God, and as he brings them out into the Sinai desert, he is showing them who he is. I am your God. You are my people. So, again, God's timing is flawless. Even though we sit for a long time in the waiting rooms of life, we have to trust that God is always on time. And in this time of waiting, we have the best opportunities to learn, to practice faith and trust in him. It's in those waiting and wondering times that we have to answer the question, why is God doing this? And that's a good question. How long, Lord? Faith is both taught and tested as we wait on the Lord. But the Lord knows how he can appear slow to us, and he knows that during those times we feel as though he's forgotten us. And when we cry out, how long? The truth of the matter is that God is never slow, as some count slowness, as Peter says. In other words, God could more often ask the question of us, how long? How long will you go halting between two opinions, as Joshua asked? God waits for us too, you know, patiently. Now, the third lesson we can learn is that even though God does begin to act, it looks for the world like things are going in the wrong direction. Not only are things not happening, but things appear to be going backwards. It's 2 steps forward, 1 back, or 1 step forward and 2 back. So that all of this looks terribly complicated. The puzzle piece just does not seem to fit in our way of thinking. But looking back over the long history, we see the whole picture. What can we learn from this as we looked at the scripture this morning? That God is doing far more than just exacting one little piece of salvation. He's working at the big picture. In this case, he's raising up and preparing Moses to be his agent of deliverance. And that takes 80 years. Let me show you. What appears to be slow and ineffective strategy is amazing when you look at it in its detail and the puzzle pieces come together. The prep work started when the order of genocide was given by Pharaoh. Can you imagine that, mothers? The terror that must have enveloped the hearts of these women. In those days, there were women who were people who helped with the birthing process. Their names are given as Amram and Jochebed. No, excuse me, that's not them. Anyway, these women are the midwives who saved the children. And they're told by Pharaoh, you've been ineffective. And then they say, of course, well, you know that these Israelite women are much stronger than the women of the Egyptians. And so they're set free. And then God blesses them. In those days, of course, the women who were midwives were women who probably didn't have children of their own. That's why they were midwives. And so that was the curse that they wore. I have no children. But now, after having done this thing that saves the babies of the Israelites, God blesses them with children, we are told. And now we have this 2 Levite people who get married. And they have children too. Their names are given in the book of Numbers, Amram and Jochebed. First of all, they have a girl named Miriam. And then they have a son named Aaron. And then 3 years later, they have the 3rd child, a boy named, later on, named Moses. Somewhere between the birth of Aaron and the birth of Moses, the new decree came out that we talked about last week, where Pharaoh said, now, not just killing babies by the midwives, but if you see a baby boy, throw him in the Nile. And if a mother won't do it for her. All baby boys must be destroyed. But Jochebed gave birth to a baby boy. Can you imagine her anguish? But out of simple mother love for her own child, Jochebed defies Pharaoh's order, and she hides the baby for 3 months, keeping him safe from death. But when he's old enough, or too old to be kept in secret any longer, his cries might have been getting louder, she decides to put him in the river. Not exactly the way Pharaoh told him to, but she has a waterproof basket. She lays the child there in the very river that he was supposed to have died. He floats in his tiny little ark, if you will. As God would have it, Pharaoh's own daughter goes down to the river and is bathing in the crocodile-infested waters. Her handmaids are alongside the river, scaring away the animals. They find the baby, and Pharaoh's daughter has compassion. And she said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. And then the daughter of Jochebed, Miriam, is standing alongside, and she says, can I help? Can I find a wet nurse to help take care of your child? And she says, go. And so Jochebed not only gets to mother her child, but she gets paid for it. This is unusual situation, you see, almost ironic. Well, no, it is ironic. But I like the idea that Jochebed and Amram, the parents of Moses, Miriam, the 2 midwives, they all get named in the scriptures. But we have no idea who that Pharaoh was. And we have no idea who his daughter was. But in all of eternity, we will know and probably get to meet Amram and Jochebed and Miriam and the midwives. Their names are known. If you read the story looking for all the subtleties that are woven into the storyline, it becomes clear how God works in amazing ways. God uses the weak, the helpless, the hopeless, people who are despised, to shame the strong. People who obviously have no power are given great power because God is with them. But here in Israel's future, hanging in the balance, depending on a helpless little baby boy to bring about deliverance, a boy whom the king had ordered to be killed, and yet now suddenly he is brought into the courts of Pharaoh, probably 3-4 years old at the time, and from that point on is raised by Pharaoh's daughter. He learns all the cultural norms of how to live in that kind of a community. He recognizes how all of the political works happen and how to address the pharaohs and all the rest. We can imagine the arm of the Lord is strong, even though it doesn't appear to be something that is any one person's doing. But then, suddenly it's 1 step forward and 2 back. Years later, as Moses realizes he's not an Egyptian, he's one of those Israelite people himself, and he has compassion on the people that are being subjected to slavery. He cares deeply for them, and so as he is caring about those people, he sees one Egyptian beating up one of the Israelite Hebrew slaves, and Moses takes it upon himself, you see. He's thinking of himself as a deliverer already, but he's got no humility. He's got no sense of what God would have him do, And rather than waiting on the Lord, he takes things into his own hands and he kills the Egyptian, hides him in the sand, thinking this could be done secretly. But somebody saw it. And of course, the next day as he goes out, he's trying to settle an argument between two Israelites, and one of the Israelites say to Moses, "Look, who made you ruler over us?" You're going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And Moses knows he's in deep, deep trouble. Now pause right there just for a second and ask the question, does this sound familiar to you? A baby who is ordered to be killed by the king, flees down into Egypt, comes back out of Egypt and sets his rule up on the kingdom's floor of the temple, and the people say to him, "Who made you ruler over us?" The parallels are just too much to ignore, and we'll see them over and over again through the entire story. But now suddenly, the one player who might have appeared to be the guy who might be the deliverer is now running for his life into the backside of the Midianite desert. Running for his life because Pharaoh has put an APB out on him and wants him killed. And once again, it looks as though the whole situation has just failed. The deliverer is gone. He's out in the Midianite desert and he saves some shepherds' girls from having been humiliated by some other shepherds. Moses gets a wife there. Moses has his first son there. And for 40 years, he lives on the backside of the desert. And now Moses is nearing 80 years old, and God says, "Now you're ready. I have humbled you as I have taught you. Now you're prepared to be my servant." We could fit our own story into this story, I'm sure. Some of us have been in God's waiting room for quite a long time. And sometimes we've asked, where is the justice that we deserve? And how long, O Lord, are we going to wait for that? And God is saying to you and to me, I hear you. I know your voice. And I am at work in your life. No injustice will go unpunished. Trust me. As churches, we need to understand that as well. I likened in this series introduction to Prosper Church as being in God's waiting room. You're waiting for the next thing to happen that God's going to be doing for and with Prosper Church. A new leader, a new pastor. And that's something to be waiting for, praying about. And sometimes we will ask the question, how long will this take? Why must we wait so long? And yet, this is God's timing. We're working, we're pushing, but we have things to do before we call. And this is the process that God wants us to follow. And as you trust in Him, you wait on Him. There are times when you will cry out, "How long, O Lord?" But don't turn your back away from that call to God. Don't be like the Israelites in the Egyptian territories who were just crying out. You can cry out and complain and groan and mumble, but that's not God's way. Call out for Him, and He will answer. Trust Him. He is faithful. Let's pray together. Lord, like the psalmist, we want to be strong and let our hearts take courage. For all who wait upon the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not be weary. They will walk and not faint. Lord, show us how to live in such faith that even though we wait,